break and said, hey guys, well, guess what? We've got a transfer.
He was my fraternity brother's older
Sacrificed
brother.
that the American people
Prosperous communities have healthy environments.
Trust now. She lived in trafficking for 4 years. I really felt, for a lot of reasons, I felt for him, but I didn't have the guts to stand.
I believe it was Mark Twain who said, truth is stranger than fiction, but it's because fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities. Truth isn't. The 2024 presidential election is a pretty good representation of that quote. And as we tape this program, there's still more to come. Tuesday, November 5th waits in anticipation of what may happen. On this edition of Conversations, we have brought together three authorities on presidential politics to discuss the 2024 election, but also to look back at the past elections and also peer ahead at how recent years may influence the future. Dr. Alfred Cuzán is a distinguished university professor at the University of West Florida. His primary focus is American and comparative politics. He is also one of the founders of Polyvote, which is a forecasting model for predicting elections. Alan Manning is an accomplished attorney with the Clark Partington law firm in Pensacola, Florida. Moreover, he is an author and presidential historian, having authored the book Father Lincoln, the untold story of Abraham Lincoln and his boys. He is currently working on a book about Theodore Roosevelt. Professor Doug Mock, Dr. Doug Mock, is an assistant professor of political science at Morehead State University in Kentucky. He was a former professor at Pensacola State College and continues to teach an online course for the University of West Florida. He is working on a book about the Supreme Court and has been published on topics including presidential debating and soon to be a chapter on the Trump administration and executive orders. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you. Great to see you again. We did a program similar to this back in 2016, and the idea was we'd do it again in 2020. And we got interrupted by a little something called COVID. And so it's great to have you back here. Now, I can remember us talking back in 2016 and thinking just how contentious things were, okay? I mean, shall we say, things had been a bit upended, and it's only been magnified since then. So, Alan, I'm going to begin with you. As you look back in history, have you ever seen anything like this?
Yeah, it's gotten worse certainly since 2016. And as I pointed out back 8 years ago, there have been very nasty, contentious elections before, going all the way back to 1800. Which was John Adams running for re-election against his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. And it was a very nasty, bitter election. Some terrible and hurtful things were said about each of them. They had been very good friends, really throughout their early careers. And the campaign, the bitterness of the campaign just wrecked their friendship for a long time. And Adams lost that election to Jefferson, and he was so upset about that loss and the way the campaign had been conducted against him that he didn't even attend Jefferson's inauguration. And then 28 years later, John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, was running for re-election, and he was running against Andrew Jackson. And that was a very nasty and bitter campaign as well. And during that campaign, some terrible things were said about Jackson's wife. The Adams campaign had alleged that she had married Jackson before her divorce from her former husband was final, and therefore calling her a bigamist. And she actually died after Jackson was elected, but before he took office. And Jackson really attributed her death to the attacks against her during the campaign. And he was very bitter toward not so much Adams personally, but against the campaign that was conducted against him. So there have been some very nasty campaigns before. 2016 was certainly one, 2020, and it just continues.
Yeah. Well, back in those days, were the constituents as contentious? I mean, obviously the candidates were, but in today's world, it seems like the constituents are just as, almost as bad, if you will.
Yeah, I don't think they were as bad. I mean, there certainly can be passion, and in a lot of the races, there would be parades and debates and things like that. I'm not sure that it has risen quite to the level now, because everybody is connected now with social media, right? You see everything on Facebook. People can post unfiltered their thoughts. And so I think that magnifies the bitterness of it all.
Well, also in 1800, for example, you didn't have many people engaging in the popular vote. The Electoral College was a real thing back then in a way that it wasn't today. Could I build off something
Please do.
that Alan said? I agree. You know, every 4 years you hear this is the most negative in history, or this is the most important election in history, or something like that. I remember every presidential election since 1972 personally, and a lot of these same themes cycle and recycle over and over again. So there is that. And Alan is right to point out that things were very ugly in 1800, 1860. Things were very ugly, certainly in 1824 and 1828. But one thing that I sort of discern that I wouldn't say is just recycling, but is sort of a new phenomena, is that the insults and the negativity, and it's not even that I have a problem so much with the negativity as such, except to the extent that it crowds out substance. And something I'm seeing in recent presidential campaigns that is different just within my lifetime is the remarkable lack of presidential candidates engaging in substantive issues anymore. I've heard very little of that in this campaign. I heard very little of that in 2020, and I think that's really a regrettable trend that we've seen just maybe in the last 8 years. One of the things that my research focuses on is looking at presidential debates and sort of doing a word analysis of that. And if you contrast the earlier debates, of course they begin in 1960 and then they pick up again in 1976, and we've had them ever since. The substance of the conversation then, as compared to now, can't help but really strike an intelligent observer. Presidential candidates didn't used to condescend to their constituents the way that I perceive them doing today. I could not imagine, we haven't yet had the Trump-Harris debate, although we have had the Trump-Biden debate. I couldn't imagine them having a conversation anywhere near the level that Kennedy and Nixon did in 1960, or Carter and Reagan in 1980, or Bush and Dukakis in 1988. And I think that's something that is relatively new, and something I find really unfortunate.
Dr. Cuzán, you want to add?
They've covered the ground very well.
Speaking of debates, I mean, as we look at this election, clearly the Biden-Trump debate was a game changer, you know. And what did you make of that as you watched that debate that night? What was going through your head from a historian standpoint?
Well, I'm not a historian, but actually, I refused to look at the debate when they started, and they began. You know, it was so unseemly. I turned off the TV. I didn't want to watch it, so I didn't watch it, the Trump-Biden debate. So I'm not even sure when I watch the next one. I'll probably start watching it, but if it degenerates like it did the first debate, Trump. Actually, I think I watched the second debate, Trump, but it was much better. But the first debate, I just turned it off. It was really bad. Well, never mind. But I don't know how that debates actually do that much. You know, it's entertainment. You know, it maybe move the needle a little bit, but I don't think they do all that much. So,
yeah. You've spent time studying debates. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? How? I mean, clearly in this particular case, it turned out to be a game changer for Biden for sure. What were you thinking as you watched?
Well, there's a couple of things. Dr. Cuzán is absolutely correct. There isn't much historical precedent for debates being game changers. One possible exception was 1976. And this illustrates a point that I think the literature shows pretty convincingly, is that we don't look for effective substantive conversations. We look for foul-ups. Mm-hmm. We look for candidates that are going to say something that sounds really stupid or that doesn't come across right. And so when I mentioned 1976, in perhaps the most famous flub, if you could call it that, in presidential debate history. Gerald Ford said there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, which was a really startling thing to say, and the polls right after the debates showed that Ford had won. And then after 24 hours of a drumbeat of a media coverage saying, what is the President of the United States thinking, that he doesn't know that the Soviet Union dominates Eastern Europe, then they decisively switched and showed that Carter had won. And of course, Carter went on to win a very narrow victory. So that may be one exception to the rule that debates, I don't even think in 1960, I don't think the debates were a game changer necessarily. This one was. Obviously not on the level of the candidate who did poorly lost, but the candidate who did poorly did so poorly that he essentially was forced to withdraw from the presidential race.
Well, I'm reading a book right now, actually, by a speechwriter for Reagan, and turns out that he had actually worked for Nixon before. I don't know his name; I don't remember it right now. But he was getting Nixon was trying to get it back in the game, and he would use him as a conduit to sort of give advice to Reagan, and you know, I think. I'm struck by how much even politicians like Nixon, so they pay so much attention to little things that happen in a debate, right? Like when Carter mentions Amy, his daughter, right? And oh my God, you know, can you imagine a president consulting his daughter over, you know, nuclear? And I don't know if I think it's a lot of theater, you know, a lot of drama and theater, but you know, I think already the polls were showing that Reagan was kind of winning, and it was very close to it. And did that debate make any difference? I really don't know. But another thing on the debate, I knew a guy. His name was J. Scott Armstrong from the Wharton School. He was one of the co-founders of the Poly. When he was the founder, and then you know I was one of the co-founders, if you will. So he said that there was some research that showed that if you listen to the Nixon Kennedy debate, that Nixon won. But if you watch the debate, you said Kennedy won. Yep. And that actually brings in Nixon, because Nixon said, you can win a debate, but you lose the audience. And the point is to win the audience. Yep. And so that's why he kept advising Reagan to win the audience. Doesn't matter whether you win or lose the debate, win the audience.
Yeah, and I think in a couple of other examples where there may have been a moment that did have some change. One was in 1980 in the Reagan-Carter debate, and Reagan, I think, was told ahead of time that you need to look presidential. People are concerned about whether you're going to be up to the job. And so, but when he made his famous statement, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And that standard is still sort of applied even today. Right. That was, I'm not going to say it was a game changer. I think the polls were trending toward Reagan, but it maybe kind of sealed the deal a little bit. One negative thing that happened during one of the debates, some of you may remember, is in the 1992 debate, which was a three-way race between Bill Clinton, the first President Bush, and Ross Perot. President Bush was caught looking at his watch at one point, and that kind of conveyed to the public that he wasn't into this. You know, he kind of wanted to get it over with. Maybe the audience wasn't important, etc. And that I think hurt him to some extent. Whether he would have still lost, you know, we'll never know. But that was certainly a negative thing that came out of that debate.
And that illustrates one of the ways that debates can turn on trivialities.
Yep.
Because when Bush was asked about that later, he said, "I was worried that Bill Clinton was getting a lot more time than me, and I just wanted to make sure that my time was equal." That was his explanation, you know. But that, you know, a debate, I don't know about an election, but that a debate maybe can turn on such a nice distinction, you know. Oh, Bush looked at his watch, I think illustrates
I think maybe the commentary.
Well, yeah,
The commentary.
yeah, that's a fair point. I mean, the commentary, I think, sort of shapes the conversation after the debate. That's true.
Well, I mean, optics truly matter. And going back to your point with Kennedy and with Nixon, you know, yes, they said if you listened to it on the radio, you felt like Nixon won. If you watched it on television, and it seems that I recall that Nixon refused to put on makeup.
That's right.
And Kennedy did. And apparently had spent some time out in the sun that day and looked refreshed and whatnot. So optics do matter, you know, from that standpoint.
The shadow, right? The shadow, right.
So it's kind of interesting from that perspective. Alan, with President Biden dropping out like he did this deep into the race, was there a historical standard for that?
There were two prior incidents, certainly different circumstances, but in 1952, President Truman, who had succeeded Franklin Roosevelt when Roosevelt died in 1945, served out the remainder of his term. Truman was then elected to his own four-year term in 1948. He was eligible to run again in 1952. The constitutional amendment that put the two-term limit was not applicable to him. And so he was eligible to run. And gave all indications that he was going to run. And I think he even entered one of the first primaries and either lost or came very close to losing and dropped out shortly after that. The second one, and really the more famous one, is Lyndon Johnson in 1968, where Johnson had, of course, succeeded Kennedy when Kennedy was assassinated, served out the remaining year or so of Kennedy's term, then was elected to his own term in 1964. He was also eligible to run again in 1968, but had become very unpopular with the Vietnam War, some of the civil rights issues, and everyone thought he was going to run. But he ended up dropping out very early on. Interesting, back then, they didn't start running for president a year and a half before the election. And Johnson dropped out, it was March of 1968 when he dropped out. So he was not deep into the primaries, but it was right at the beginning of the primary season.
It was almost like after the first primary in New Hampshire,
yeah, right.
When
I think he
McCarthy
came in,
won.
he won the.
He won. He came second, but he won.
Had a great showing.
Yeah, his opponent had a great showing, and I think Johnson saw the writing was on the wall and didn't want to lose, and so he stepped aside.
Well, and then Bobby Kennedy jumped in. I forget.
Robert Kennedy
jumped in,
was
and Humphrey, and that was at a time when a lot of the delegates were not necessarily chosen through the primary system. The party machinery would pick the delegates, and so Vice President Humphrey actually didn't win very many primaries at all, but still won the nomination because he had control of the party through Johnson.
That's right, and it was after that in the McDonald-Fraser Commission that the way we nominate presidents changed, because Humphrey would not have won the rank and file. Correct. He was far less popular than Eugene McCarthy or Robert Kennedy before the Kennedy assassination. Of course, the cases that Alan refers to, what they all have in common is that you had incumbent presidents who were, as you say, saw the writing on the wall. They were all likely to lose. Biden was likely to lose this race. Johnson was probably going to be defeated in 68, and Truman almost certainly would have lost in 52. People forget about Harry Truman that he was an extraordinarily unpopular president. And people forget that because, he's so highly rated by historians today, correctly in my judgment, but he was extraordinarily unpopular in 1952. And if Eisenhower had been his opponent, as presumably he would have been, Eisenhower would have won that race in a landslide, I have no doubt.
Were you surprised that President Biden ran again? I mean, because there had been obviously talk about his age and declining popularity, et cetera, for quite some time. I mean, were you surprised that he decided to give it a shot?
I was, only because, his age, I think, was certainly a factor. And, very few presidents have successful second terms. It's usually a tough slog for most of them. And he could point to some accomplishments and could have left office popular, unselfish. I'm going to hand it over. I came in, I said I was going to do this, I accomplished it, I'm stepping aside. And I think there was an opportunity for him to do that. So I was a little surprised that he decided to run.
What I'd like to see is a historian, a political scientist, 10, 15 years from now, who will look at the records of the White House and do for the Biden administration what has been done about the second Woodrow Wilson administration. That when Woodrow Wilson was basically incapacitated, and who was actually running the White House then. And I think eventually we'll find out who actually was running the White House under Biden. I think he was pretty much out of it from one the little tidbits we get. And who actually was running the White House?
Yeah.
You know.
I think that's correct. President Biden's, I think it's been clear for some time, not just months, but for a couple of years. I'm not a medical doctor, but in my judgment, there's something going on that I want to be careful about what I say, but I think, I'm glad Dr. Cuzán brought up Woodrow Wilson, because when you read biographies of Wilson, he thought he was running for a third term. Mm-hmm. And of course, he was completely incapacitated. We now know by a massive stroke, and he had no business being president the last year plus of his administration. But into 1920, he was convinced that he was going to run again, and he had to have folks sort of step in and say, "This is just not possible." And I think you had a similar situation with President Biden. I mean, look, it's hard to give up power,
sure.
Right? Nobody wants. That's one of the reasons we honor George Washington, is because he could have been reelected over and over again for the rest of his life, and he chose not to. But Washington was the exception. It's hard to step down when you think you can win, and I think ultimately the clincher for the president's decision not to continue was, I think he was convinced that he was not going to win.
But was it really his decision?
Well,
To be found out 15 years
That's
from
what we
now.
need to find out.
That's what I think,
that's for future historians.
And by the way, the evidence seems to indicate that in Woodrow Wilson's case, it was his wife that was running the show. In fact, to the point where I think they found some documents where they think she even signed his name to things.
So that signature looked an awful lot like he was writing.
That is fascinating.
So I agree. I think that it will take a decade or two, but eventually this story will be told. What was going on behind the scenes, it will come out at some point as to what has been going on or what was going on behind the scenes.
Well, if that. And let me say this, because I know all of us want to tread very lightly on this, and none of us are pretending to be a doctor or make any kind of diagnosis. But going back to what we were speaking of a moment ago about optics, okay, whether President Biden has any medical issues there or not, we don't know, but the optics would give one an impression that perhaps there are some struggles. So going back to maybe 10 years from now, we look back and some of that is legitimized. What kind of responsibility is on his cabinet? I mean, what kind of responsibility is on Vice President Harris to stand up and say, he's not up to the job?
The Vice President's in a very difficult situation under the current constitutional amendment that deals with what we'll call disabilities. If the President becomes disabled, unable to function but still alive, and it's a decision that's made by the cabinet and the Vice President. And of course, the Vice President has a conflict of interest in that decision making, and so I think most Vice Presidents would, in that position, wouldn't want to seem like they're trying to push the President out, and really would try to leave it up to others to be the driving force behind it. That's my guess as to how it would play out.
Yeah, invoking the 25th Amendment would be a very politically tricky thing, and it, I mean, it has to be the president's own people who do it, and from a political standpoint, I think that's very tricky. The 25th Amendment was partly a response to the assassination of President Kennedy, and folks thinking, well, what if he had lived in a vegetative state? Now, the original Constitution does specify that the Vice President assumes the powers and duties of the presidency in the event of the death or the inability to carry out the powers and duties, but it's not clear how that would be executed. You know, and that's one of the things that the 25th Amendment, I think, clarifies. I don't really think the 25th Amendment was intended to be used in a case like this, more like in a case that a president is so clearly incapacitated. And the other provision about presidential succession is not self-executing, so the 25th Amendment spells out a way to execute, a way to remove a president. But I'd be surprised if I ever saw it happen in my lifetime. I frankly would be surprised if a single cabinet member would vote in favor of it, let alone a majority.
Well, I was going to say they would have a conflict of interest too, most likely.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly the vice president
Clearly.
would, but there would be a conflict for most of the, so yeah, that's kind of a tricky situation there.
It is.
I guess, from that standpoint. As we sort of look ahead with this, and we talked about this is not the first time around that we have seen somebody, you know, step away, but what is the biggest challenge in your view of kind of what Vice President Harris faces from a standpoint of the way that she came into? I mean, it was almost like she was, well, I guess it was almost, was anointed essentially, right? I mean, so there was no other competition, if you will. What are your thoughts on the way that transpired?
Well, the fact that she was anointed, because one of the sort of themes that the Democratic Party has put out there with respect to President Trump is that they're looking to save democracy because he's a threat to democracy. I won't express any opinion as to whether I agree with that theme or not, but it's hard to make that case when nobody voted for Kamala Harris as the presidential nominee. So in some respects, that it seems to me sort of takes that issue away from her. And then substantively, you know, like so many presidential campaigns, this one will be about enthusiasm. It'll be about voter turnout. I mean, you know, there's enough people that want to vote for Donald Trump that he can win. There's enough people that want to vote for Vice President Harris that she can win. So the real question is, well, who gets to the polls? Who actually casts votes? So the Vice President has to be very careful, and we've seen this abundantly demonstrated because those who are most enthusiastic about her are going to be those who are pretty much on the left end of the political spectrum. Now, most Americans are not on the extremes of the political spectrum. Most Americans are not far left or far right, but most enthusiasts are. Mm-hmm. Most people who are really, really into politics tend to be firmly right or firmly left. So her challenge is to drum up support, turnout among her base, which is very left, while not offending sort of the swing voters, the middle of the road voters, with scary, you know, socialist sounding ideas. And it's a hard, I wouldn't want to be in that position. And one thing you've seen is that she hasn't said too much substantively yet, and I think that's the reason. And I mean that's her biggest challenge.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Nixon kept hammering in his advice to Reagan was keep hammering on the bread and butter issues, mm-hmm. The economy. And I remember also when Nixon won in '68, remember law and order because there was a lot of disorder, a lot of mm-hmm. crime mm-hmm. and so forth. And when you look at the, what are the surveys that ask the public, what is the most pressing problem in the country in your opinion? They mention the economy, they mention crime, illegal immigration. Those are the three highest, the ones that get the most mention.
Right.
And I think if Trump would, if Nixon, if the ghost of Nixon would come over and try to whisper things in Trump's ear, that's what he should be hammering. He would say, economy, crime, illegal immigration. And I think he's doing better in that respect. He's sort of, I remember I saw an interview with a man I never heard of before. It turns out he's a Russian immigrant who came here 20 years ago, and he's a computer analyst, some sort of, but he actually also has a podcast. And he interviewed Trump for a whole hour. And he tried to ask Trump about 2016, no, I'm sorry, about 2020. And Trump sort of evaded the whole thing. He wasn't talking about 2020 and revisiting that issue. He kept talking about illegal immigration, the economy, and crime. He kept just talking about that. And also, he also mentioned Afghanistan and the way Afghanistan was handled or mishandled, as the case may be. So I think Trump is being a little bit more focused this time. So I think so. We'll see. If he can address effectively the things that are most in the minds of people now, inflation, crime, illegal immigration, and every day something comes out somewhere, Aurora, Colorado, or this or that, and you know, if he can just hammer those things, and he's been doing that, I think, repeatedly. I think he's going to do better. He is doing better in the polls and in the models than he did in 2016 or 2020.
That's right.
I recommend that people watch, of course, look at the polyvote. I am no longer with the polyvote. I retired from the polyvote a few years ago because I was running a book, and it's still there, and it's well done. But there's another side. I check the polyvote, and I also check not 538 too, but also the Silver Bulletin.
Nate Silver.
Silver Bulletin. Nate Silver actually was the one who had the 538 a while back, and he's actually a very good forecaster. Anyway, he's showing Trump ahead on the Electoral College vote, not in the so-called popular vote.
Right.
But decisions are not made. Decisions in the presidential elections, the American way of electing presidents is not the popular vote. Right. It's the Electoral College. And in fact, not even the phrase Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution. Okay? They talk about electors. So we need to focus on what's going in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. Those are the 5 states that keep coming up as being the important states where it's been decided. And apparently he's ahead in all of them except Wisconsin. Michigan is now ahead by a little bit. It's not like a lot, right? So it's kind of still very close, but it's actually his last probability for Trump winning is like 58% probability that he will win the election, really.
Right.
Not in the Electoral College, because the popular vote doesn't matter. Right. In fact, I have an article on that. I called it "In Defense of the American Way of Electing Presidents." And I'll send you a copy. Okay. I'll send you all a copy.
And the copy you sent me, I
you?
think Silver today had Trump at a 62% probability, which but it's not. That's not as impressive as it might sound, I mean.
Well, it's a lot more impressive than it was when in 2016.
Well, that's true. That's true. And Trump tends to underpoll.
In 2016, Silver had him at 25%, which was the highest of any other forecaster.
That's right. But I do want to point out. Let me put it this way: if I told you you're going to get on a plane and it had a 62% chance of landing safely, you wouldn't get on that plane, right? And it's the same thing. It's a point that I think needs stress. These election models and Silver's are very good. One of the things you saw after the 2016 election, I saw repeatedly, and you're right, Silver had Trump below 30% probability, and a lot of folks said, well, see, he was wrong. Mm-hmm. But that's incorrect. That's not the way. I mean, that means, there are a lot of variables that are going to happen up to the election, and even on election day. The weather in certain parts of the country may affect turnout for one group or the other. So when Trump had a 25% chance of winning in 2016, I will confess I was stunned when Trump won. I didn't expect that either. But to say that Silver was wrong then is not correct. You know, a 25% chance of something happened.
You might say that he was right.
Yeah,
because the other
forecasters, that 1 in 4
the
chance.
other forecasters gave him like 1% or 2%, something
Right.
like that. And when he came out with 25%, everybody else were piling on him, you know, because
That's right.
how you're crazy, and turned out that, you know.
And the important point here is, and I think this is something we've seen more awareness of, especially in light of the 2000 election and the 2016 election, where we have disparate impacts or disparate outcomes between the electoral vote, which is what matters, and the nationwide popular vote, which is irrelevant except as it impacts the electoral vote. But to a certain extent, you still see the leads in the story about the nationwide popular vote. And this has shown a pretty steady, small, but a pretty steady lead for Vice President Harris. The problem, as Al points out, is that doesn't matter. You know, and it's frustrating to see that as the lead of the story all the time. Is, well, there's a, you know, Harris is up by 3 points or whatever in the nationwide popular vote.
Who cares?
Because I mean, if she wins California by 30 points,
Right.
which she will, that doesn't help her in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin or Georgia or Arizona, because she needs to win those states as well, regardless of how much she runs up the score in California or New York or some of those bigger states that she is going to win.
And some of that is why it is showing her with a big lead, because she can win these big population states
Right.
by a lot of votes, millions
Right.
of votes in the case of California, New York, Illinois.
Exactly.
But Trump can win some of these other smaller states by very small margins, and so overall she racks up a lot of votes, but not necessarily in the right place.
And that's exactly what happened in 2016.
And what we're saying, he wins California or New York, we're talking about he wins Los Angeles, San Francisco, basically those two huge metropolitan hubs.
Right, right.
New York is New York City. And so we need to kind of be very careful when we say he wins California or New York, because actually his huge margin that
Right.
Hillary Clinton had
Right.
in 2016 was in basically 4 or 5 counties.
Yeah, it was the big
New York
cities.
City,
That's right.
DC, Los Angeles, and some of the San Francisco counties. Now, those places are not all that representative of the rest of the country.
Right.
I would argue that an electoral college, so-called, is much more representative of the country than
Right.
Los Angeles.
Sure,
It's
sure.
just,
Yeah,
without taking anything away from Los Angeles, it
Yeah.
is not representative of the country.
Well, like somebody said one time, there's a whole lot of real estate between Manhattan and Malibu, right?
Well, yeah, and I have nothing against Los Angeles or New York either, but it's a good point, because if you look at the map of the Electoral College in 2016, broken down by county, not by state,
Or even by precinct.
or by precinct, you see a flood, a sea of Trump red. I mean, you could fly from coast to coast and not fly over a county that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. So maybe sometime we'll have a debate about the Electoral College, but it does require that you have breadth of support as well as depth of support. This is an argument for keeping it.
Well, and I have to ask that question because it comes up. A lot of people say we should do away with the
Right.
Electoral College. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, it would require a constitutional amendment because it's in the Constitution. There is a workaround, which would take quite a while to go through the details. It's called the National Popular Vote Movement. In a nutshell, states pass laws saying we will award our electoral votes to whichever candidate wins the nationwide popular vote, provided, however, that this law only takes effect when states with the magic number of 270 have the same law on the books. That would make it impossible for one candidate to win the popular vote and yet lose the Electoral College. So that would be a constitutional workaround. But of course, the smaller states don't want that. The bigger states that are still swing states, Florida, don't want that, and I don't think that has any chance of getting the requisite 270. If that doesn't happen, you need a constitutional amendment, and you're not getting a constitutional amendment. You're not getting 38 states.
And it's not clear that thing that actually would pass muster.
From a constitutional standpoint. Yeah, it's controversial from a constitutional standpoint. It's called the National Popular Vote movement.
But it's trying to get around the Constitution.
But unless, and there actually is a book by the dean, I don't know if he's a retired dean, but the dean of one of the prestigious California law schools, maybe Stanford, Edwin Cherminsky, I think his name is. It's I don't want to hawk.
Chemerinsky.
I don't want to hawk his book. Yeah, thank you. But he actually said we need to tear up the Constitution and start over. I haven't read the book, but but I understand that's the idea behind it. And maybe one of his objections is the Electoral College. If we stick with our current Constitution, it needs a constitutional amendment. It's not happening. So we're either blessed with it or we're stuck with it, depending on your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with everything Doug said. I mean, it's not going to go away soon. So the candidates just need to figure out a way to win with it the way that it is.
It'll certainly be, things have a tendency to go in cycles, right? So regardless of what happens this time around, do you foresee things maybe balancing out a little bit more where there's not so much of the, contentious, mean-spirited type approach to things? Or do you think that the cat's out of the bag and this is the future of America? Because going back to your point earlier, Doug, you were talking about, I believe, that, the far left or far right has a tendency to kind of, be the folks who are excited about everything and use the analogy, the tail wagging the dog. Do you see us continuing in that sort of environment?
Well, my pessimistic self says until, and maybe I shouldn't even say my pessimistic self, maybe I should say my civically minded self, says until more mainstream folks get in the political process early on, I think the logic of the way our elections system works, our electoral two-party system, kind of drives us to the conclusion that the genie's out of the bottle sort of thing. I've seen some indicia of hope that things might change. But look, here's the problem. Nobody that I know, and if you look at the polls, I think you see this true writ large. Nobody wanted a Biden-Trump rematch. Nobody wanted that. And yet somehow that's what we were getting until the president dropped out. So why are we getting these matchups that nobody wants? And I think the answer to that question is it's because it's the political activists, the folks who and even in smaller non-representative states that go early in the primary system, you had a big brouhaha with respect to Democratic Party rules a few years ago, a couple of election cycles ago, where states who were later on the primary calendar tried to leapfrog and were willing to lose like half of their delegates because it's so important what happens in Iowa, and it's so important what happens in New Hampshire. That system is dysfunctional. And it's not like anybody designed it. There's not a master designer somewhere who said, let's put New Hampshire and Iowa, or in the case of what benefited President Biden, then Joe Biden in 2016, the state of South Carolina. Nobody had this master plan. Let's put those states first and make them disproportionately influential, but that's where we are, and I frankly don't know how to fix it. It's party activists, people who sort of, in an amateur sense, do politics for a living, who make these decisions. I mean, does anybody out there really think, well, this was democracy at work? when we got Donald Trump and initially Joe Biden again? I don't think so, because poll after poll showed nobody wanted that. So there have to, I think there's going to have to be
when
some
you say
fundamental
nobody
changes.
wanted that, you know, I mean.
Well, when I say nobody, I mean I'm exaggerating, but let me qualify it. The overwhelming majority of Americans did not want that. Democrats didn't want Joe Biden. Republicans didn't want Donald. A lot of them, you know,
No, I
don't know how to
I
fix
agree
it.
with that. It's just the absolute, yeah, the absolute statement. But would it be any different if it would be DeSantis against Newsom? Would it be any different? I mean, the issues are still there.
I think personality can play into that. You know, Trump's a big personality, obviously, and that can, if you had two people who had more of a statesman type personality that would substantively debate the issues, I think that's what we're sort of yearning for. But whether those people could rise to the top or not, that's the big question in this environment. And you know, one other thing I would just add to this, and this is at the congressional level, but I think it influences at the presidential level. One of the, I think, causes of a lot of the division in the country is the way that we have done a reapportionment, redistricting every 10 years. Because what's happened in the House of Representatives is that out of 435 seats, you know, whenever reapportionment is done, the lines are redrawn, and there's the political party that's in charge in that state has a lot of influence in drawing the lines and can favor one party or another.
Right.
And out of 435 seats, there are probably only about 80 seats that are competitive, okay? And what that has done is that in both parties, the election is really held in the primary.
Right.
The winner of the Republican primary is going to be the representative from that district. The winner of the Democratic primary is going to be the winner in that district. And so what has happened in both parties is that the extremes, they out conservative each other, or they out liberal each other to win that seat. And so the people that then get sent to Washington are the extremes and not looking to compromise and so on and so forth in this. And I think that has been part of the problem in this whole debate thing, is that the Republicans or the Democrats, the middle is sort of gone from the political spectrum at this point. And I think if you don't have that middle, then when you get up to the presidential level, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to have just this very divisive type campaign. And I find it interesting in a way, because, and I'm going to be very kind of general about this, but I would say that I'm not too off in saying, you know, 46% of the people are going to vote for Trump no matter what. Right. And 46% of the people are going to vote for Harris no matter what. And it's really that 8% in the middle that is going to decide this election. And I always find it interesting that sometimes the candidates still don't talk to that 8%. They're kind of going after their 46%, which are going to vote for them anyway. Right. And I think that and that is just part of this division. And people don't want to look weak in their own party. If they compromise on something, then they're going to be attacked in their next primary election as being weak.
Well, and I think Alan raises a really good point, which is now when you're campaigning, given that each party has a certain base that they can absolutely count on. This wasn't always true. I mean, Walter Mondale won 41% or something in 1984. George McGovern didn't hit 40% in 1972. So this business of everybody has a base of 45% is a relatively new phenomenon. And I think one result of that is there's more of an emphasis on turn out my people than there is on persuade the unpersuadable, because there aren't that many unpersuadable. You know, one of the questions I got a lot in 2016 was, why was Donald Trump coming to Pensacola or this area so frequently, which he did? Well, the answer to that question is easy, is because his internal polling showed that he was doing really, really well in Pensacola. Florida was going to be close, so turn people out in the Pensacola area, you know, a relatively small market that got an inordinate amount of attention from Trump in 2016. So you have a different focus, and one consequence of this is well, you know, the art of accommodation, the art of compromise, or even, you know, to be seen as willing to entertain compromise. It's almost viewed as traitorous with some folks. And this notion of redistricting, I think that's a good point too. There's actually a name for it in the political science literature. It's called vanishing marginals. A marginal is a congressional district that could swing either direction. There used to be hundreds of them. I don't think there's 80 left. I think there may be 30 or 40 left. You know, a congressional race that legitimately could go one way or the other. And Alan is absolutely right. The decision is made in you know, the first congressional district of Florida. Let's face it, the decision is made when the Republican primary is over.
Sure.
That's it. And again, the literature shows pretty convincingly that however much we kid ourselves otherwise, we vote for people who think the most like us. You know, if you ask somebody, what do you base your vote on? We'll say things, oh, we look for integrity, we look for experience, we you know, baloney. We look for people who think like us. Well, if it's the party activists who are making the decision in July as opposed to November, well, that's the people that aren't amenable to compromise.
Well, there are a couple of things I can say about that. One is we could increase the number of congressmen. There's no reason, there's no magic number. Why do we have that many, 435? We could have more, right? I mean, the law was passed back in 1914, I think it was, to limit the number. So we have actually, relative to the population, we have a relatively small number of representatives. England, for example, the UK has like over 600.
Right.
The other thing I would say is sometimes we are too solipsistic. In other words, we think the problems that we have are unique. We see a lot of contention in France. So, you know, this polarization is not unique to us. Look what's happening in France right now. And they split three ways, and there's no way to, you know, there was an election in two of these states in Germany last Sunday, and there will be another one this Sunday. And the parties in the center, they collapsed. And you have parties on a new party on the left, and the Alliance for the Alternative for Germany got a third of the vote. We have to realize that these problems are not unique to us. Okay, they are across pretty much the democratic spectrum, the democratic countries. And I think some of the issues, I think we face some of the same issues of immigration, the economy, and in our case, abortion is a very divisive issue. So I think to look at abortion today and to look at the polarization on that issue compared to the slavery issue back in the 19th century, I think there are some parallels. And I don't see maybe there might be a better chance to sort of try to moderate that, because when you ask people about abortion, you know, we have some people like, under no circumstances, and others say all the way up to birth, and if the child survives an abortion, let him die on the table and not assisted. There are some people who actually say that. So, but there are people that are somewhere in the middle, and that would be a little better than, a little more amenable to some sort of a compromise than slavery. You either accept slavery or you don't. And so that brought us to the Civil War. But in this case, I think there might be a way to sort of find some different ways of middle ground. But In Florida, we have an amendment just to do just that, and so we'll see how that turns out. So, but those are very contentious issues. I don't think yes, all the things that you say are true, but say if we're getting the farthest to the left guy in the Democratic side getting say a third or 40% of the vote and getting the nomination, well, how about having a second round? We could have a second round in the nomination process in this district. Enlarge the number of districts. The other thing you can do is do not allow congressional districts to cross county lines. Draw congressional districts around county lines. Yeah. Okay, so then you have you can't gerrymander so much, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that would be a way to do it. So there are ways that we can handle those problems. In some states like Iowa, that's what they do. They have their congressional districts they do not cross county lines. And then, for example, if in Dade County, which is going to get, of course, quite a few congressmen, well, you could go follow maybe school district lines, or you could follow, here we could follow school district lines or county districts, the District 1, District 2, and so forth. So there are ways that we can engineer, engineer the political structure to try to handle those issues. They're not insurmountable.
Some objective, sort of natural way to draw lines as opposed to what's going to win the party that controls the legislature the most seats.
I have a little less than 2 minutes. Thank you, but I want to ask all of you, I think you said you were working on a book?
I already published the book.
And the name of the book?
Laws of Politics.
Okay.
It's available in Amazon, publisher Routledge.
Alan, you have a book already and working on another?
I'm working on a book on Theodore Roosevelt. It's still working on the manuscript. Hope to have it done in a year or so.
Okay. And Father Lincoln out there still?
Out there. Came out in paperback also a couple years ago.
Very good. And Doug, you're working on something yourself?
I am working on a book, Natural Law and the History of Supreme Court Jurisprudence, and my current research focuses on doing word studies of presidential debates, and I'm kind of illustrating how the substantive content of that, what I alluded to, I think, at the beginning of this program, has deteriorated markedly, in my judgment. And I think there's objective evidence for that, not just my judgment.
Fascinating. Fascinating conversation with you three. I mean, again, to kind of recap, when I opened the program, I mentioned the fact that we had gotten together back in 2016 and had a great conversation, and then unfortunately due to COVID we're unable to do it in 2020, so I'm thankful that we were able to get back together here in 2024, and hopefully we'll sit down and do it all again in 4 more years.
Sounds great.
That would be fun. Dr. Alfred Cuzán, Alan Manning, Dr. Doug Mock, our guest, talking about presidential politics, kind of looking at the current environment as well as looking back in history and maybe just kind of taking a little glance at what we might be looking at as we move forward in this world. So thank you all very much, and we greatly thank our viewers for watching our program. And by the way, you can see this and many more of our conversations on the PBS video app and also out on YouTube. You can also check us out at WSRE.org/conversations. I'm Jeff Weeks. Thank you so very much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful